The training ground stretched endlessly under 3 purple suns, its crystalline sand shifting like liquid mercury in the alien light. Ela Martinez wiped sweat from her brow as she watched the other recruits struggle through their exercises. The Terano instructors moved between them like predators, their six-limbed bodies graceful despite their intimidating size. Pathetic, growled Instructor Kethvar, his mandibles clicking in disgust. You humans claim to be warriors, yet you cannot even lift a basic gravity hammer. Ela kept her mouth shut and continued her stretching routine. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself rarely ended well. Back on Earth, she had been just another face in the crowd at the Seoul Defense Academy. Average scores, average performance, average everything. When the Galactic Defense Coalition offered spots in their elite Terano training program, Ela had barely made the cut. The other human recruits were impressive specimens. Marcus Chen had been a champion martial artist before joining. Sarah Walsh held 3 planetary records in combat sports. Devon Cross came from a military family that traced its service back to the old Earth Wars. Then, there was Ela, a mechanic's daughter from the asteroid mining colonies who had never won a single competition in her life. The human with the dark hair, Kethvar's voice boomed across the training ground. You there, hiding behind the others. Ela's heart sank. She had been discovered. Yes, instructor, she replied, stepping forward. The other recruits created a circle around her, their faces showing mixtures of pity and relief that they had not been chosen. Kethvar's 4 eyes studied her with predatory intensity. His species, the Kethani, were renowned throughout the galaxy as master warriors. Their training methods had produced some of the finest soldiers in Coalition history. They were also known for their complete intolerance of weakness. What is your name, small one? Ela Martinez, instructor. Ela Martinez, he repeated, his translator struggling with the human pronunciation. Tell me, Ela Martinez, why are you here? The question caught her off guard. Why was she here? The honest answer was that she did not know. When the recruitment officers had come to the mining station where she worked, something inside her had whispered that this was her chance. Her chance for what, she could not say. I want to serve the Coalition, instructor. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Service. A noble goal. But, this is not a charity organization, little human. This is Terano training. Do you know what that means? Ela nodded. Everyone in the galaxy knew about Terano training. It was the most elite military program in existence, designed to create super soldiers capable of operating in any environment against any enemy. The graduation rate was less than 10%. Most who failed were simply sent home. Some were sent home in medical pods. A few were sent home in cargo containers. Then, you understand that weakness is not tolerated here, Kethvar continued. You understand that failure means disgrace not just for yourself, but for your entire species. Yes, instructor. Good. Kethvar gestured toward a section of the training ground where massive blocks of compressed metal sat waiting. Your first test begins now. You will move that block from here to the target zone. You have 1 standard hour. Ela looked at the block and felt her confidence crumble. The thing was easily 3 times her size and had to weigh several tons. She watched as Marcus stepped up to his assigned block and began to push. His enhanced muscles bulged with effort, and the block slowly began to move across the sand. Sarah attacked her block with systematic precision, using leverage and technique to overcome the weight disadvantage. Devon simply put his head down and bulldozed forward through pure determination. Ela approached her block and placed her hands against its cold surface. She pushed with everything she had, but the block did not budge even a centimeter. The other recruits were already making steady progress toward the target zone while she remained frozen at the starting line. Having trouble, Martinez, called out Zara Okonkwo, one of the more arrogant human recruits. Maybe you should have stayed in the asteroid belt where you belong. Ela ignored the taunt and tried again. This time she attempted to find leverage points like Sarah was using. Still nothing. The block might as well have been welded to the ground. Time grows short, little human, observed Kethvar as he prowled past. Perhaps you would like to quit now and save yourself further embarrassment. The suggestion stung worse than any insult. Ela had been counted out her entire life. Too small, too weak, too unremarkable. When other children played sports, she fixed their equipment. When classmates competed for academic honors, she helped them study. She had always been the support character in other people's stories. But something had changed the day she decided to apply for Terano training. For the first time in her life, she wanted to be the hero of her own story. She was tired of being invisible. Tired of being dismissed. Tired of being told what she could not do. Ela stepped back from the block and really looked at it for the first time. The compressed metal gleamed dully in the alien sunlight. It was not a single piece, she realized, but rather multiple plates fused together under tremendous pressure. The fusion points created subtle stress patterns across the surface. Her years working in the asteroid mines had taught her to read metal like other people read books. Every piece of ore told a story about pressure and heat and time. This block was no different. She traced one of the stress lines with her finger, following it from the top edge down to where it met another line near the base. The intersection formed a weak point, barely visible to the naked eye, but definitely there. Ela had spent her childhood watching her father work magic with scrap metal and broken machinery. He had taught her that force was not always the answer. Sometimes you had to find the right pressure point. Sometimes you had to work with the metal instead of against it. She positioned herself carefully and placed both palms flat against the intersection point. Instead of pushing, she pressed inward while simultaneously twisting her wrists. For a moment nothing happened. Then, the block shuddered. A hairline crack appeared along the stress line, running from her hands toward the top of the block. The crack widened as internal tensions that had been locked in place for who knew how long suddenly found release. The massive block split cleanly in half. The training ground fell silent except for the whisper of wind across crystalline sand. Every eye was fixed on Ela as she stood between the two halves of what had moments before been an immovable object. Marcus had stopped pushing his block and was staring open-mouthed. Sarah's systematic technique had faltered as she turned to see what had caused the sudden quiet. Even Devon's bulldozer approach had ground to a halt. The alien instructors were conferring in rapid clicks and whistles, their translator devices struggling to keep up with the rapid exchange. Only Kethvar remained focused on Ela, his four eyes unblinking as he studied her. "Interesting," he said finally. "Most humans would have attempted to use brute force. You chose a different path." "The metal wanted to break along that line," Ela explained, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I just helped it remember how." Kethvar's mandibles clicked rapidly, definitely amusement this time. Helped it remember. A curious way to phrase it. He gestured toward the target zone. "You still must complete the exercise, Ela Martinez." Moving the halved blocks was much easier. Ela was able to roll them across the sand one at a time, reaching the target zone while several other recruits were still struggling with their intact blocks. As she positioned the second half in the designated area, she became aware that the other students were watching her with new interest. Some looked impressed. Others appeared suspicious or even hostile. Zara's expression had shifted from mockery to barely concealed anger. "Beginner's luck," Zara muttered as she finally managed to budge her own block. "Anyone can get lucky once." But Ela did not think it had been luck. For the first time in her life, she had trusted her instincts instead of second-guessing herself. For the first time, she had acted like she belonged somewhere instead of apologizing for taking up space. The next exercise was combat training with shock sticks, electrified batons that delivered a painful but non-lethal charge when they made contact. The recruits were paired off randomly for sparring matches. Ela found herself facing Torvin Blackclaw, a Kethani recruit whose species was naturally suited for combat. His forearms gave him a tremendous advantage in weapons work, and his reflexes were faster than any human could hope to match. "Try not to get yourself killed, little human," Torvin hissed as they took their positions. I would prefer not to explain to the instructors why my opponent stopped moving. The other matches had already begun around them. The sound of shock sticks clashing filled the air, punctuated by occasional yelps of pain when someone failed to block fast enough. Ela gripped her weapon tightly and tried to remember everything she had learned about combat during her brief time at the Seoul Defense Academy. Torvin attacked immediately, his 4 weapons moving in a complex pattern designed to overwhelm her defenses. Ela managed to block the first few strikes, but she was quickly driven backward across the training circle. A shock stick slipped past her guard and caught her across the ribs. Pain shot through her side as the electrical charge scrambled her nervous system. She stumbled and barely managed to avoid a follow-up strike that would have caught her in the head. Pathetic, Torvin sneered. Is this the best humanity has to offer? Ela circled warily, looking for an opening that she knew was not coming. Torvin was too skilled, too fast, too strong. Every conventional tactic she attempted was easily countered. Within minutes she was covered in painful welts from shock stick hits. But, as the beating continued, something strange began to happen. Ela found herself studying Torvin's fighting style with the same analytical mindset she had applied to the metal block. Every fighter had patterns, rhythms, preferences. Even the most skilled warriors developed habits. Torvin favored his upper right arm for power strikes. His lower left moved a fraction of a second slower than the others. When he pressed an attack, he unconsciously shifted his weight to his dominant foot. More importantly, Torvin was arrogant. He was so confident in his natural advantages that he was not taking Ela seriously as an opponent. He was showing off for the instructors rather than focusing on ending the match quickly. Ela began to change her defensive strategy. Instead of trying to block everything, she focused on avoiding the power strikes while accepting lighter hits from his weaker attacks. She started moving in ways that encouraged Torvin to use his preferred combinations. To the observers, it looked like she was being systematically dismantled. In reality, she was learning. After 10 minutes of apparent punishment, Ela saw her opportunity. Torvin wound up for one of his favorite power combinations, a high strike with his upper right followed by a low sweep with his lower left. The pattern was so ingrained that he executed it the same way every time. This time, instead of backing away from the high strike, Ela stepped forward and to the side. Torvin's shock stick whistled past her ear as she moved inside his reach. His lower left was still completing its sweep, which meant he was off balance and could not bring his other weapons to bear. Ela drove her shock stick into the nerve cluster just below his primary shoulder. Torvin's scream echoed across the training ground as electricity coursed through his nervous system. His weapons fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, and he collapsed to the sand in convulsions. For the second time that day, the training ground fell silent. Cathvar approached the sparring circle, his expression unreadable. Explain what happened here, Ela Martinez. He has a pattern, Ela said simply. Upper right power strike followed by lower left sweep. He uses it when he thinks he has his opponent beaten. I waited for the pattern and stepped into the gap. You waited, Cathvar repeated. For 10 minutes, you allowed yourself to be struck repeatedly, also that you could identify a pattern that appeared perhaps 3 times during the match. Yes, instructor. Cathvar studied her for a long moment. Around them, the other matches had stopped as everyone strained to hear the conversation. Most warriors seek to end combat quickly, he said finally. They rely on superior speed, strength, or skill to overwhelm their opponents. You chose to endure punishment in order to study your enemy. Why? Ela thought about the question. The honest answer was that she had not really chosen anything. She had simply done what came naturally. When faced with a superior opponent, she had done what she always did. She had observed, analyzed, and looked for the weakness that every system possessed. Because I cannot win through strength, she said. So I have to win through understanding. Cathvar's mandibles clicked rapidly. Understanding. Another interesting choice of words. He looked around at the assembled recruits. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Victory does not always belong to the strongest or fastest. Sometimes it belongs to the one who sees most clearly. As the training day continued, Ela found herself being watched more carefully by instructors and fellow recruits alike. Some seemed impressed by her unconventional solutions. Others appeared skeptical, waiting for her to fail at something that could not be solved through analysis. The final exercise of the day was endurance running. The recruits were required to complete a 10-kilometer course that wound through the most challenging terrain the training facility had to offer. Rocky hills, deep sand pits, obstacle walls, and water hazards all waited to test their limits. This was the kind of challenge where Ela's lack of physical advantages would be most apparent. She was smaller and lighter than most of the other humans, and she could not hope to match the natural endurance of species that had evolved on high-gravity worlds. As they lined up at the starting line, Marcus leaned over to her. "Listen, Martinez, I know you pulled off some impressive stuff today, but this is different. This is about pure physical ability. Don't feel bad if you can't keep up." His tone was not unkind, but the words stung nonetheless. Ela had heard variations of that speech her entire life. Well-meaning people telling her not to feel bad about her limitations. Helpful advice about knowing when to quit. The starting signal echoed across the desert, and the recruits surged forward. Ela settled into a steady pace that she knew she could maintain. She had no illusions about winning the race, but she was determined to finish it. The first few kilometers passed through relatively easy terrain, and the pack remained tightly bunched. Ela found herself running alongside Devon, who had decided to pace himself rather than sprint ahead like some of the others. "You surprised a lot of people today," he said as they navigated around a cluster of crystal formations. "Including me." "I surprised myself," Ela admitted. That business with Torvin was pretty impressive. Most people would have given up after the first minute. Ela did not respond immediately. She was watching the terrain ahead, noting how the path wound between rock formations that would provide both opportunities and hazards. "My father used to say that the mind always wins in the end," she said finally. "But sometimes you can convince it to give you what you need before it crushes you." Devon laughed. "I have no idea what that means, but it sounds profound." As they approached the halfway point, the real challenges began. The course led up a steep hillside covered in loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot. Several recruits had already fallen behind, and others were beginning to show signs of serious fatigue. Ela felt the burn in her legs as she climbed, but she maintained her steady pace. She watched the leaders struggle with the unstable surface, their powerful strides working against them as they generated small avalanches with each step. Once again, Ela found herself analyzing the problem. The scree was unstable, but it was not random. There were patterns in how the rocks were distributed, safer paths that could be identified if you knew what to look for. She began to adjust her route, stepping on larger stones that were more likely to be stable, avoiding areas where the smaller rocks had obvious gaps beneath them. Her pace actually increased as she found the rhythm of the safer path. By the time she reached the top of the hill, she had passed several recruits who had started the race ahead of her. More importantly, she was not breathing as hard as she should have been after such a climb. The descent was even more treacherous than the ascent. Several recruits suffered painful falls as they tried to maintain their speed down the rocky slope. Ela descended more carefully, again reading the terrain and choosing her path with deliberate precision. At the bottom of the hill, the course entered a section of deep sand that had been designed to exhaust even the strongest runners. Here, pure physical power was supposed to determine success. Ela watched the leaders struggle as their feet sank into the shifting surface with each step. But sand was not her enemy, sand was an old friend. Ela had spent her childhood playing in the artificial gravity chambers of the mining station, where engineers tested different substrate densities for optimal extraction efficiency. She understood how granular materials behaved under pressure. Instead of fighting the sand, Ela learned to work with it. She shortened her stride and changed her foot placement to minimize energy loss. She found the patches where the sand was more tightly packed and the areas where underlying rock provided better support. Once again, her pace increased as others began to fade. By the time the finish line came into view, Ela was running in fourth place overall and second among the human recruits. The spectacle had drawn a crowd of instructors and support staff who watched in amazement as the smallest human in the group maintained her position against much larger and stronger opponents. She crossed the finish line exhausted but triumphant, collapsing onto the cool sand as her body finally acknowledged the punishment it had endured. Around her, other finishers were gasping for air and nursing various injuries from their battles with the course. Marcus finished 30 seconds behind her, shaking his head in disbelief. "How?" he gasped as he collapsed beside her. "How did you do that?" Ela smiled as she stared up at the alien sky. "I listened to what the course was trying to tell me," she said. As the day ended and the recruits were dismissed to their quarters, Ela walked slowly across the training ground. Her body ached in a dozen places, and she knew tomorrow would bring new challenges that might not be so easily solved through observation and analysis. But, for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. For the first time, she was not apologizing for her presence or making excuses for her limitations. She was simply being herself, and that was apparently enough. Behind her, she could hear the other recruits discussing the day's events. Some were already making excuses for their performances or complaining about unfair advantages. Others were plotting how they would reclaim their positions in tomorrow's exercises. Ela did not join these conversations. She was too busy thinking about what she had learned, not just about mental stress patterns and fighting rhythms and sand distribution, but about herself. Maybe everyone had been wrong about Terano training being easy. Maybe it was not supposed to be easy. Maybe the real test was not whether you could do easy things, but whether you could find your own way to do impossible things. Tomorrow would bring new impossibilities. Ela found herself looking forward to meeting them. The alarm shrieked through the dormitory at what felt like the middle of the night, though the three purple suns never truly set on this world. Ela jerked awake to find emergency lights strobing red patterns across the walls. Around her, other recruits stumbled from their bunks in confusion. "Emergency drill," roared Instructor HFY as he burst through the dormitory doors. "All recruits to the assembly point in 60 seconds. Move." Ela grabbed her training uniform and boots, dressing quickly as chaos erupted around her. This was their third week of Terano training, and the instructors had been escalating the difficulty with each passing day. What had started as individual challenges had evolved into complex team exercises that tested not just physical ability but leadership, cooperation, and tactical thinking. The assembly point was a large circular platform in the center of the training complex. As recruits arrived, they found it surrounded by a dozen alien instructors from various species. The atmosphere was tense, electric with anticipation. "Form ranks," commanded Instructor Veltar, a towering Zenthran whose species resembled crystalline trees. "Today you face the trial of the broken chain." Ela felt her stomach drop. She had heard whispers about this exercise from senior trainees. The trial of the broken chain was legendary among coalition forces, a test so difficult that entire classes had failed it completely. No one who had taken the trial was allowed to discuss the specifics, but the failure rate spoke for itself. "You will be divided into teams of 5, Veltar continued. "Each team will be given an objective that appears simple. I assure you it is not. The trial will test everything you have learned about combat, strategy, survival, and teamwork. Some of you will discover strengths you did not know you possessed. Others will discover that strength alone is insufficient." The instructors began calling out team assignments. Ela found herself grouped with Marcus Chen, Sarah Walsh, a Kethani recruit named Zikar, and, surprisingly, Zara Okonkwo. The combination made her nervous. Zara had made no secret of her resentment toward Ela's recent successes. "Team 7, announced HFY as he approached their group. "Your mission is to retrieve a data core from the shattered maze and return it to this platform within 6 standard hours. The core contains critical intelligence about enemy positions. Failure to retrieve it will result in the deaths of thousands of coalition soldiers." He handed Marcus a small device that looked like a modified compass. "This will point you toward the general location of the maze entrance. Once inside, you are on your own. Questions?" "What's the shattered maze?" asked Sarah. HFY's mandibles clicked ominously. "You will discover that for yourselves. Move out. The device led them across the training complex toward a section that Ela had never seen before. As they walked, she noticed that the landscape was changing. The crystalline sand gave way to darker soil, and twisted metal structures began to emerge from the ground like the bones of some massive creature. "This is new," muttered Marcus, consulting the compass device. "I don't remember this area from our orientation tours." "They build new sections all the time," Zekar explained. His forearms moved in complex patterns as he spoke, a nervous habit she had observed in many Kethani. "The training evolves to challenge each new class." After an hour of walking, they crested a low hill and saw their destination spread out before them. The shattered maze was unlike anything Ela had ever seen. Massive walls of black metal twisted and curved through a depression in the landscape, their surfaces covered with glowing symbols that pulsed in hypnotic patterns. The walls seemed to move slightly, shifting and rearranging themselves even as they watched. "It's alive," whispered Sarah. "Not alive," corrected Zekar. "But not entirely mechanical either. Some kind of hybrid technology. My people have legends about such constructs from the ancient wars." Zara snorted derisively. "Legends and bedtime stories won't help us complete this mission. Let's just get in there, grab the data core, and get out." She started down the hill without waiting for the others. Marcus called after her, but she ignored him and continued toward the maze entrance. "She's going to get us all killed," Sarah muttered. Ela studied the maze more carefully as they followed Zara down the hill. The walls were not randomly arranged, there was a pattern to their configuration, though it was subtle. The glowing symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with some internal process, and she noticed that certain sections of the maze glowed brighter than others. "Wait," she called out. "Something's not right." But Zara had already reached the entrance, a tall archway flanked by pillars covered in warning symbols. She stepped through without hesitation, and immediately the maze began to react. The walls shifted with grinding mechanical sounds, and the entrance sealed itself behind her. "Zara!" Marcus shouted, running toward the sealed entrance. But there was no response from within. Ela approached the barrier more cautiously, studying the symbols that covered its surface. They were similar to mathematical notation, but with subtle differences that suggested they represented something more complex than simple arithmetic. "It's a logic gate," she realized. "The maze is testing us before it will let us enter." "Testing us how?" asked Sarah. Ela traced one of the symbol sequences with her finger. The pattern reminded her of the diagnostic codes she had worked with in the mining equipment back home. "I think we have to solve the puzzle to gain entry." "What kind of puzzle?" "The symbols represent different logical operations. If we can input the correct sequence, the gate should open." Ela studied the patterns more carefully. "But there are thousands of possible combinations. It could take hours to solve by trial and error." "We don't have hours," Marcus pointed out. "Zara is trapped in there, and we only have 6 hours to complete the mission." Zekar stepped closer to examine the symbols. "My species has some familiarity with ancient logic systems. Perhaps if we work together." For the next 30 minutes, the four of them studied the puzzle, trying different approaches and combinations. Ela found herself taking the lead in analyzing the symbol relationships, while Zekar provided insights into the cultural context behind the notation. Marcus and Sarah tested different sequences based on their conclusions. Finally, Ela noticed something that made her pause. "The symbols aren't random," she said suddenly. "Look at this section here. It's the same pattern that appeared on the training ground yesterday during the gravity manipulation exercise." "You think the maze is connected to our previous training?" asked Marcus. "Not just connected, it's learning from our performances. The puzzle is personalized based on what we've already demonstrated we can do." This insight changed their entire approach. Instead of trying to solve an abstract logical problem, Ela began looking for elements that related to their individual strengths and previous successes. She found symbol sequences that corresponded to her analysis of the metal stress patterns, Marcus's martial arts combinations, and Sarah's systematic approach to problem solving. When they input the combined sequence, the entrance reopened with a satisfied chime. Inside the maze, they found Zara standing motionless in a circular chamber, her eyes glazed over as she stared at a wall covered with shifting patterns. She did not respond when they called her name.
She's been hypnotized, diagnosed Zikar.
The maze has trapped her consciousness in some kind of feedback loop.
Ela approached the wall that held Zara's attention.
The patterns were mesmerizing, geometric shapes that folded in on themselves in ways that seemed to defy physics. She could feel her own mind beginning to drift as she watched them.
Don't look directly at it, she warned the others. It's designed to capture your attention and hold it.
How do we free her? Asked Marcus. Ela forced herself to look away from the hypnotic patterns and study the chamber itself. Like everything else in the maze, it was covered with symbols and indicators that suggested underlying logical processes. The chamber is another puzzle, she concluded. We have to solve it to release her.
This puzzle was more complex than the entrance gate.
It required not just logical analysis but also physical manipulation of various controls and switches. The 4 team members had to coordinate their actions precisely, with each person responsible for maintaining specific patterns while others worked on different aspects of the solution. It took them another hour to figure out the correct sequence, but eventually Zara blinked and shook her head as if waking from a deep sleep.
What happened? She asked groggily.
You triggered a trap, Ela explained.
The maze is more than just a physical obstacle, it's designed to test mental discipline as well as problem-solving ability.
Zara looked embarrassed and angry in equal measure.
I didn't know.
None of us knew, Marcus said diplomatically.
That's why we need to work together. This place is too dangerous for solo heroics. As they progressed deeper into the maze, they encountered increasingly complex challenges. Some corridors filled with toxic gas that required them to solve breathing apparatus puzzles before they could proceed. Others contained gravity fields that shifted randomly, forcing them to navigate using magnetic anchor points embedded in the walls. Each challenge required a different combination of skills and knowledge. Ela found herself becoming the team's primary analyst, identifying the underlying logic behind each obstacle. Marcus provided leadership and coordination. Sarah contributed systematic methodology and attention to detail.
Zikar offered cultural insights and technical knowledge about alien technologies.
Even Zara proved valuable once she overcame her initial embarrassment.
Her aggressive approach was exactly what was needed for certain challenges that required bold action rather than careful analysis. The deeper they went, the more Ela realized that the maze was not just testing their individual abilities, it was teaching them how to function as a unified team. Each challenge was designed to require cooperation and trust between team members with very different strengths and approaches.
They reached the maze's center after 4 hours of steady progress.
The heart of the labyrinth was a vast spherical chamber with walls that curved away in all directions. Floating in the center of the space was a crystalline data core that pulsed with internal light.
That's it, breathed Marcus. That's what we came for.
But reaching the core was not going to be simple. The chamber was filled with a complex network of energy beams that crisscrossed the space in constantly shifting patterns. Touch one of the beams and the resulting shock would be powerful enough to incapacitate or even kill.
It's like a 3-dimensional maze, observed Sarah.
We have to find a path through the energy fields to reach the center.
Ela studied the beam patterns carefully.
They were not random, there was definitely a mathematical progression to their movements.
The beams follow a repeating cycle, she announced. But the cycle is incredibly complex.
It would take hours to map it completely.
We don't have hours, Zikar pointed out. We have less than 2 hours to get back to the assembly point. Zara stepped forward with determination. Then, we do this the direct way.
I'll run through the beams and grab the core. Even if I get hit, I should be able to reach it before the shock knocks me out.
No, said Ela firmly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got you trapped in the first chamber. This maze is designed to punish reckless action. Then, what do you suggest? Zara demanded. Ela continued studying the energy patterns.
The beams moved in complex spirals and helixes, creating brief windows of opportunity for someone fast and agile enough to exploit them. But predicting when and where those windows would appear required understanding the underlying mathematical principles. "I think I can map the safe zones," she said finally. "But I'll need absolute precision from whoever makes the attempt. One mistake and they're dead." "I'll do it," volunteered Marcus. "I have the best reflexes." "No," said Ela. "I have to do it. I'm the only one who understands the pattern well enough to improvise if something goes wrong." The others protested, but Ela was adamant. This was not about bravery or heroism, it was about using the right tool for the job. She was the smallest and most agile member of the team, and she was the only one who had developed an intuitive understanding of the maze's logical systems. She spent 10 more minutes studying the patterns, memorizing the rhythm and timing of the energy beam cycles. When she finally stepped into the chamber, her movements were precise and economical. She did not waste motion or hesitate when windows of opportunity appeared. Halfway to the center, she encountered a pattern she had not anticipated. A beam appeared where her calculations said there should be empty space. She twisted desperately in midair, feeling the energy discharge singe her hair as it passed inches from her head. But, instead of panicking, Ela used the near miss to refine her understanding of the system. The beams were not just following mathematical patterns, they were reacting to her presence, adapting their configurations to increase the difficulty. Armed with this new insight, she adjusted her approach. Instead of trying to avoid all the beams, she began using their adaptive responses to create the windows she needed. She moved in ways that encouraged certain beam configurations while discouraging others. To the others watching from the chamber entrance, it looked like an impossible dance between human reflexes and alien technology. Ela seemed to flow through the three-dimensional maze like water, always arriving at exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She reached the data core without being touched by a single beam. But, as her fingers closed around the crystalline device, the chamber's configuration changed dramatically. All the energy beams converged on the center position, creating a cage of lethal force around her. "Ela," shouted Marcus. She was trapped. The same adaptive intelligence that had made the maze more difficult had now made it impossible. There was no safe path back to the entrance. "I'm okay for now," she called back. "But I can't get out. The system has locked me in." Zekar studied the new configuration with growing understanding. "It's not a trap," he realized. "It's another puzzle. The maze wants us to solve it before it will release her." This final challenge required all 5 team members working together. While Ela remained trapped in the energy cage, the others had to manipulate controls throughout the chamber to gradually reconfigure the beam patterns. It was like conducting an orchestra where every musician was in a different location and the sheet music kept changing. Sarah coordinated timing from her position near the main control panel. Marcus and Zara took opposite sides of the chamber to handle the secondary systems. Zekar used his 4 arms to manipulate multiple interfaces simultaneously. And, throughout it all, Ela provided real-time analysis of how their actions were affecting the beam patterns, calling out adjustments and refinements as the energy cage slowly dissolved around her. When the final beam disappeared and Ela was free to move, they had less than 30 minutes to get back to the assembly point. The return journey through the maze was a frantic race against time, with shortcuts and risks that would have been unthinkable during their careful initial approach. They reached the assembly platform with exactly 2 minutes to spare. Instructor Kethvar accepted the data core with no visible emotion. "Acceptable," he said simply. "Team 7 has successfully completed the trial of the broken chain." As they stood catching their breath, Ela looked around at her teammates. 6 hours ago, they had been 5 individuals with different backgrounds and competing goals. Now they felt like something more, a unit that was greater than the sum of its parts. "That was insane," gasped Zara. "I can't believe we actually did it." "We almost didn't," Marcus pointed out. "If Ela hadn't figured out how the maze systems worked. If any of us hadn't done our part, we would have failed," Ela corrected. "That was the point of the trial.
It wasn't about individual achievement, it was about learning to function as a team.
Zikar's mandibles clicked in agreement. The ancient texts speak of such trials. They were designed not to test what warriors could do alone, but what they could accomplish together.
Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I think I understand now why the graduation rate is so low. It's not because the challenges are impossible, it's because most people never learn to trust each other completely.
That evening, as Ela lay in her bunk reviewing the day's events, she realized that something fundamental had changed. For the first time since arriving at Terano training, she felt like she truly belonged. Not because she had proven herself individually, but because she had discovered how her unique abilities could contribute to something larger than herself. The trial of the broken chain had been designed to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new puzzles to solve and new obstacles to overcome. But now she would face them not as Ela Martinez, the undersized girl from the mining colonies who had somehow talked her way into an elite military program. She would face them as part of Team 7, a unit that had learned to transform individual weaknesses into collective strength. Outside her window, the three purple suns cast their eternal light across the training complex. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and obstacle courses, new recruits were arriving to begin their own journeys through Terano training. Some would discover strengths they never knew they possessed. Others would find that strength alone was not enough. A few might even learn, as Ela had, that the greatest victories came not from overpowering your enemies but from understanding them so completely that you could turn their own systems against them. The shattered maze still stood in its hidden valley, its walls shifting and reconfiguring themselves as they prepared to test the next group of recruits. The ancient intelligence that controlled it had learned something new today. It had discovered that sometimes the smallest piece of the puzzle could be the key to solving the entire system. And, in her quarters across the training complex, Ela Martinez smiled in her sleep and dreamed of crystalline walls that bent to her will and energy beams that danced to patterns only she could see. The simulator chamber hummed with barely contained energy as Ela stepped through the entrance. 8 weeks into Terano training, the facility had become her second home, but this particular room still made her nervous. The advanced combat simulation system could create any environment, any enemy, any scenario that the instructors could imagine. More importantly, it could kill you if you made serious mistakes. Real weapons, real consequences, Instructor Veltar had explained during their orientation. The only difference between this chamber and actual combat is that we can retrieve your body if you fail. Today's exercise was different from anything they had attempted before. Instead of working with their established teams, the recruits had been randomly redistributed into new groups. Ela found herself separated from Marcus, Sarah, Zikar, and Zara for the first time since the trial of the broken chain. Her new team consisted of 3 recruits she barely knew. Devon Cross, the human from the military family who had always been polite but distant. Krentai, a massive hegemony warrior whose species resembled armored bears. And, most surprisingly, Torvin Blackclaw, the same Kethani she had defeated in their shockstick sparring match weeks earlier. The tension in the group was obvious. Devon seemed uncomfortable with the random assignment. Krentai spoke little and trusted humans even less. Torvin's 4 eyes burned with barely contained hostility whenever he looked at Ela. "Attention, Test Group Delta," announced Instructor Kethvar through the chamber's communication system. "Your mission is to infiltrate the Vanguard research station and retrieve classified weapon prototypes before enemy forces can capture them. Intelligence suggests the station has been overrun by Ravager shock troops. Resistance will be extreme." The chamber dissolved around them, replaced by the interior of a space station that was clearly under attack. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows. Somewhere in the distance, the sounds of battle echoed through the corridors, weapons fire, explosions, and the inhuman screams of dying aliens. "The weapon prototypes are located in Laboratory 7, Kethvar continued. "You have 45 minutes to reach the lab, secure the prototypes, and extract to the shuttle bay. Failure is not acceptable." A holographic map appeared in front of them, showing the station's layout. Laboratory 7 was located in the central hub, protected by multiple security checkpoints and surrounded by areas that the map indicated were heavily defended. "Simple enough,"
growled Krentai. We fight our way through whatever stands between us and the objective. It won't be that easy, Devon pointed out, studying the map more carefully. Look at these defensive positions. The enemy has had time to establish overlapping fields of fire throughout the central corridors. A direct assault would be suicide.
Torvin's mandibles clicked dismissively.
Typical human thinking. You see obstacles everywhere instead of opportunities for glory. Glory doesn't complete missions, Ela said quietly. Strategy does. All three aliens turned to stare at her. She had been content to listen and analyze during the initial planning phase, but their approaches were all fundamentally flawed. You have something to contribute, little human? Asked Torvin, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Ela studied the holographic map more carefully, rotating it to see the station's layout from different angles. The defensive positions were indeed formidable, but they were designed to repel attacks along predictable routes. More importantly, the map showed infrastructure details that her teammates were ignoring. The Ravagers are expecting us to attack through the main corridors, she explained. But space stations have maintenance shafts, service tunnels, and emergency passages that weren't designed with combat in mind. Crawling through ventilation ducts like vermin, snorted Krentai. Where is the honor in such tactics?
There's no honor in failure either, Devon replied thoughtfully. He was studying the map with new interest.
Ela's right. If we can find an alternate route to the laboratory, we might be able to avoid the majority of their defensive positions.
Torvin remained skeptical.
And what happens when we encounter resistance in these narrow passages? We would be trapped like animals in a cage. Then, we make sure we don't encounter resistance, Ela said.
She highlighted several sections of the map where service tunnels intersected with main corridors. We can use these access points to monitor enemy movements and time our advance to avoid patrol routes.
You want us to hide and sneak like cowards, Torvin accused.
I want us to succeed, Ela replied calmly. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that the frontal assault is exactly what your enemy expects. They spent several more minutes debating tactics before settling on a compromise approach. They would attempt to use the maintenance passages as Ela suggested, but with contingency plans for direct combat if stealth failed. As they moved deeper into the station, the simulation's realism became increasingly apparent. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic taste of recycled atmosphere.
Bodies of station personnel lay scattered in the corridors, their wounds gruesomely realistic.
In the distance, the sounds of battle continued.
Ela took point as they entered the first maintenance shaft.
Her small size was an advantage in the cramped conditions, and her experience working in the tight spaces of mining equipment had prepared her for navigating complex mechanical environments. The shafts were a maze of pipes, conduits, and support structures. Emergency lighting provided minimal illumination, and the constant vibration from the station's damaged systems made every step treacherous. But they also provided exactly what Ela had promised, a route that bypassed the heavily defended main corridors.
20 minutes into their infiltration, they reached an intersection where the maintenance shaft connected to a major corridor through a ventilation grate.
Ela carefully removed the grate and peered into the hallway beyond. What she saw made her blood run cold. The corridor was filled with Ravager shock troops, massive insectoid creatures that moved on four legs and carried energy weapons integrated into their armored carapaces. But these were not the mindless beasts that Coalition propaganda portrayed them as. They were moving with discipline and coordination, establishing security checkpoints and communication relays with military precision.
How many? Whispered Devon from behind her.
At least 30 in visual range, Ela replied.
And they're not just occupying the station, they're fortifying it.
She studied the enemy positions more carefully, noting their patrol patterns and communication protocols. The Ravagers were following standard military doctrine, which meant their behavior would be predictable if you understood their tactical preferences.
They're rotating guards every 10 minutes, she reported. And they're maintaining overlapping sensor coverage throughout the corridor.
But there's a 15-second gap in their surveillance pattern when the patrols change positions. 15 seconds is not enough time to cross that corridor, Krentai pointed out. It is if we don't all cross at the same time, Ela said. She was already working out the timing in her head.
One person goes during each rotation.
By the time the fourth person crosses, we'll have 15 minutes before the first guard change cycle repeats.
Devon nodded slowly.
It's risky, but it could work. Who goes first?
I do, said Ela.
I'm the smallest and fastest. If anyone can make it across without being detected, it's me. Torvin's eyes blazed with indignation.
This is madness.
We should strike quickly and overwhelm them with superior firepower.
With what superior firepower? Ela asked.
There are 30 of them and 4 of us.
Even if we won, the noise would alert every Ravager in the sector.
They waited for the next guard rotation, timing the patrol movements with careful precision. When the 15-second window opened, Ela dropped through the grate and sprinted across the corridor. She reached the opposite maintenance access just as the new guards settled into their positions.
One by one, her teammates followed.
Devon crossed during the next rotation, his military training evident in his smooth, economical movements. Krentai barely fit through the maintenance shaft opening, but his natural stealth abilities allowed him to cross the corridor without detection. Finally, Torvin reluctantly followed the plan, his multiple limbs allowing him to move with surprising grace despite his obvious displeasure with the tactics. As they continued through the maintenance shafts toward Laboratory 7, Ela found herself taking more of a leadership role. Her ability to read the station's infrastructure and predict enemy movements made her the natural point person for navigation and tactical planning.
Next intersection is directly above the laboratory, she announced as they reached a junction where multiple shafts converged. But we have a problem.
Through the ventilation grates, they could see that Laboratory 7 was heavily guarded.
A dozen Ravager shock troops surrounded the entrance, while others had taken positions throughout the laboratory itself.
The weapon prototypes they needed to retrieve were visible through the transparent containment units, but reaching them would require fighting through overwhelming opposition.
Now we do this my way, declared Krentai, checking his weapons. No more crawling and hiding.
Wait, said Ela.
Let me think about this.
She studied the laboratory layout through the grate, noting not just the enemy positions but the arrangement of equipment and experimental devices. Laboratory 7 was clearly a high-energy physics facility, with massive power conduits and exotic matter containment systems throughout the space.
Those containment units, she said suddenly.
They're using magnetic field generators to stabilize exotic matter reactions.
So, asked Devon.
So if the magnetic fields were disrupted, the exotic matter would become extremely unstable.
The resulting energy release would be,
she calculated quickly in her head, substantial. Torvin's mandibles clicked with understanding.
You want to turn their own laboratory into a weapon. Not a weapon, a distraction.
If we can cause a controlled destabilization of the exotic matter, the resulting energy discharge will disable their electronics and force them to evacuate.
We can retrieve the prototypes during the confusion. Devon looked skeptical. How do we control the destabilization?
One mistake and we could blow up half the station.
Ela smiled grimly. We don't control it. We calculate it.
She spent the next several minutes studying the laboratory's power distribution systems and exotic matter configurations. The setup was similar to equipment she had worked with in the asteroid mines, where exotic matter was used to enhance our processing efficiency. The principles were the same, just scaled up to research facility levels. The containment units are connected to a central power grid, she explained. If we overload the grid at exactly the right frequency, we can cause a cascade failure that will discharge all the exotic matter simultaneously. The energy release will be massive but brief, like a very bright flashbulb. How do we access the power grid? Asked Krentai. Ela pointed to a maintenance panel visible through the grate.
The power conduits run through the maintenance shafts.
I can tap into the grid from here and introduce the overload frequency.
And how do you know the exact frequency required? Torvin demanded. Because I've seen this type of equipment before.
Exotic matter resonance patterns are universal, they follow the same mathematical principles regardless of who builds the containment systems. The plan was risky, but it was also their best chance of completing the mission without engaging in a firefight they could not win. Ela carefully removed an access panel and began working with the power conduits, using her multi-tool to create the connection she needed. "This is insane," muttered Devon as he watched her work. "You're about to overload a high-energy physics laboratory based on mining equipment experience." "Physics is physics," Ela replied, making final adjustments to her improvised frequency generator. "The principles don't change just because the applications are different." She activated the device and watched as energy readings throughout the laboratory began to fluctuate. The exotic matter containment units started glowing brighter as their magnetic field generators struggled to compensate for the frequency interference. "How long until the cascade failure?" asked Krentai. 30 seconds, Ela replied. "When it happens, the energy discharge will overload their electronics and temporarily blind anyone looking directly at the containment units. We'll have maybe 2 minutes to get in, grab the prototypes, and get out before their systems reset." The cascade failure was even more spectacular than Ela had predicted. The laboratory filled with blazing light as exotic matter throughout the facility discharged its stored energy in a coordinated pulse. The Ravager guards stumbled blindly as their electronic systems failed and their natural photosensitive organs were overwhelmed by the brilliant display. Team Delta dropped through the ventilation grate and moved quickly through the chaos. Ela navigated directly to the prototype storage units while her teammates provided security. The weapon prototypes were contained in portable cases that could be easily carried. 2 minutes are almost up, warned Devon as they secured the final prototype. They made it back to the ventilation system just as the laboratory's emergency lighting began to reactivate. The Ravager guards were still disoriented, but their electronics were starting to come back online. The extraction to the shuttle bay was a race against time as alarms began sounding throughout the station. But by then, they were back in the maintenance shafts, following routes that Ela had memorized during their initial infiltration. They reached the shuttle bay with 3 minutes to spare. "Mission completed successfully," announced Instructor Kethvar as the simulation environment dissolved around them. Team Delta retrieved all weapon prototypes without sustaining casualties. As they emerged from the simulation chamber, Ela noticed that her teammates were looking at her with new respect. Even Torvin's hostility had been replaced by something that might have been grudging admiration. "I have underestimated you, Ela Martinez," he said formally. "Your unconventional tactics achieved victory where traditional approaches would have failed." Krentai nodded agreement. "You fight with your mind instead of your weapons. It is effective." Devon clapped her on the shoulder. "That was some of the most impressive tactical thinking I've ever seen. You turned their own laboratory into a weapon without firing a single shot." But, as they walked back to the debriefing room, Ela found herself thinking about something deeper than tactical success. Today had been the first time she had taken clear leadership of a team that included recruits who were physically stronger and more experienced than herself. The difference was that she was no longer trying to prove she belonged at Terano training. She had stopped apologizing for her approach and started trusting her instincts completely. When she analyzed problems and proposed solutions, she did so with confidence rather than hesitation. The exercise demonstrates an important principle, Instructor Veltar explained during the debriefing session. Leadership is not about physical dominance or aggressive tactics. Leadership is about seeing solutions that others cannot see and having the courage to act on your vision. He looked directly at Ela as he spoke. Sometimes the most effective warrior is the one who wins without fighting. That evening, as Ela reviewed the day's events, she realized that Terano training had taught her something unexpected. She had arrived thinking that she needed to become stronger, faster, more aggressive, more like the other recruits who seemed naturally suited for military life. Instead, she had discovered that her greatest strengths came from being exactly who she was. Her analytical mind, her experience with complex systems, her ability to find unconventional solutions, these were not weaknesses to be overcome but advantages to be leveraged. The simulation had presented them with an impossible tactical situation, overwhelming enemy forces in a heavily defended position.
Traditional military thinking would have focused on firepower, speed, and aggressive action.
But the real solution had required understanding the underlying physics of the environment and turning that knowledge into an advantage.
Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new scenarios designed to push the recruits to their absolute limits.
But Ela no longer worried about whether she could keep up with the others. She had learned to play to her strengths instead of apologizing for her limitations. More importantly, she had learned that true leadership was not about commanding others to follow your vision. It was about creating solutions so elegant and effective that others wanted to be part of making them succeed. As she drifted off to sleep, Ela smiled at the memory of Torvin's formal acknowledgement of her tactical abilities. 8 weeks ago, he had dismissed her as too weak and small to be a real warrior. Tonight, he had learned that sometimes the smallest person in the room could see the biggest solutions. The Terano training program was designed to forge elite warriors who could face any challenge and overcome any obstacle. But Ela was beginning to understand that the greatest warriors were not necessarily the strongest or fastest or most aggressive. The greatest warriors were the ones who could look at impossible situations and find the hidden possibilities that everyone else had missed. She was becoming one of those warriors, one impossible solution at a time.
The final examination arena was unlike anything the recruits had seen during their 12 weeks of Terano training.
Instead of the familiar crystalline sands and metal obstacles of the main training complex, they found themselves standing on a platform suspended above a massive spherical chamber that stretched away in all directions. The sphere's walls were covered with thousands of hexagonal panels, each one displaying different alien landscapes.
Forests of crystal trees under purple skies. Volcanic wastelands where lava flowed upward in defiance of gravity.
Underwater cities built from living coral that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. "Welcome to the reality engine," announced Instructor Veltar, his crystalline voice echoing in the vast space. "This chamber can simulate any environment, any enemy, any scenario that exists within the Coalition's database. More importantly, it can combine elements from multiple realities to create challenges that have never existed before."
Ela stood with the other remaining recruits on the central platform.
Of the 200 candidates who had begun Terano training 12 weeks ago, only 37 remained. The others had been eliminated through injury, psychological breakdown, or simple inability to meet the program's impossible standards. She looked around at the familiar faces of those who had survived. Marcus, Sarah, Devon, Zikar, and even Zara had made it through the brutal selection process. So had Torvin, Krentai, and a handful of others who had proven themselves capable of transcending their initial limitations. But today was different. Today they would face their final test not as teams or training groups, but as individuals. Each recruit would be inserted into a personalized scenario designed specifically to exploit their greatest weaknesses while demanding the absolute peak of their abilities. "The scenarios you will face are classified as unsurvivable," Veltar continued. "They are based on actual combat situations where entire battalions of coalition forces were destroyed. Your mission is not merely to survive, but to achieve objectives that trained military units could not accomplish."
Ela felt her stomach tighten.
The instructors had been building toward this moment since the first day of training, gradually escalating the difficulty of each challenge until the recruits were operating far beyond normal human limitations.
But this felt different.
This felt final. "You will be evaluated on tactical decision-making, adaptive problem-solving, leadership under extreme stress, and innovative application of available resources," Veltar explained.
"Success will earn you graduation and assignment to Coalition Special Forces units.
Failure." He did not need to finish the sentence.
Everyone knew that failure in the final examination meant more than just elimination from the program. It meant that the reality engine's safety protocols would be disabled, making death or permanent injury very real possibilities. Recruit Martinez called Instructor Kethvar.
"You are first."
Ela stepped forward on unsteady legs.
She had known this moment would come, but she still felt unprepared despite 12 weeks of intensive training. Around her, the other recruits offered silent expressions of support. Even Torvin clicked his mandibles, and what she had learned was a gesture of respect among his people. A beam of light descended from the chamber's ceiling, engulfing her in a column of energy that tingled against her skin. The platform beneath her feet dissolved, and she felt herself falling through endless space toward one of the hexagonal panels that had begun to glow with increasing intensity. Reality reformed around her with jarring suddenness. She was standing in the command center of a Coalition research station, but everything was wrong. Emergency lighting bathed the room in hellish red shadows. Computer screens displayed cascading system failures. In the distance, she could hear the unmistakable sounds of battle energy weapons, explosions, and the dying screams of sentient beings. A holographic figure materialized in front of her, a Coalition officer with desperation etched across his alien features. "Thank the void you made it through," the officer gasped. "I'm Commander Velzon of the Meridian Research Station. We've been overrun by Ravager forces, but that's not our biggest problem." The hologram gestured toward a massive display screen that showed the station's central laboratory. Inside, Ela could see a device that made her blood run cold, a prototype weapon that looked like a miniature star contained within geometric force fields. "The Ravagers are trying to capture our stellar compression weapon," Velzon continued. "If they succeed, they'll have enough firepower to destroy entire star systems. We've lost contact with the laboratory, but our sensors indicate they haven't breached the final containment barriers yet." "What do you need me to do?" Ela asked. "The weapon's core must be destabilized before they can extract it. But the process requires someone to manually initialize the destruction sequence from inside the laboratory. It's a suicide mission. The energy release will vaporize everything within a kilometer of the device." Ela studied the display screens more carefully, noting the station's layout and the distribution of enemy forces. The scenario was clearly designed to test her willingness to sacrifice herself for the greater good, a classic military ethics dilemma with no good answers. But, as she examined the technical specifications of the stellar compression weapon, she noticed something that made her pause. The containment system was similar in principle to the exotic matter equipment she had worked with during previous exercises, just scaled up to astronomical proportions. "Show me the weapon's technical specifications," she requested. A holographic display shifted to show detailed schematics of the device. Ela studied them intently, her analytical mind dissecting the relationships between the various subsystems and components. "This isn't actually a weapon," she realized suddenly. "It's a power generation system." Commander Velzon's expression shifted to confusion. "I don't understand." "Look at these energy flow patterns," Ela explained, highlighting specific sections of the schematic. "The stellar compression isn't designed to create an explosive release, it's designed to generate controlled fusion reactions for power generation. Someone has modified the containment systems to make it look like a weapon, but the underlying physics are completely different." She continued studying the schematics, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place in her mind. "This is a trap. The Ravagers aren't trying to steal a weapon, they're trying to trick us into destroying our own research facility." The implications were staggering. If the Coalition destroyed the research station to prevent weapon capture, they would lose years of scientific advancement and dozens of irreplaceable researchers. The Ravagers would achieve a strategic victory without having to fight for it. "But our sensors clearly show Ravager forces throughout the station," Velzon protested. Ela accessed the sensor data and began analyzing the signatures more carefully. The readings showed the characteristic energy patterns of Ravager shock troops, but there were subtle anomalies that bothered her. "The sensor readings are correct," she admitted. "But look at the movement patterns. Real Ravagers move in coordinated assault formations. These contacts are moving randomly, almost like they're trying to be detected rather than avoiding our sensors." She pulled up additional data streams, comparing current readings with historical baselines from previous Ravager encounters. The differences were subtle but significant. "These aren't Ravager forces," she concluded. "They're holographic projections designed to simulate an invasion. Someone is using our own defensive systems against us. But who would have the access and expertise to infiltrate Coalition systems so completely?" Ela studied the technical signatures of the holographic projections, looking for clues about their origin. "The projections are being generated from inside the station," she discovered. Someone with administrative access has activated the training hologram systems and modified them to simulate a Ravager attack. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they revealed was deeply troubling. This was not an external attack, it was sabotage from within the coalition itself. "Commander Velzon," she said carefully. "How long have you been stationed on Meridian?"
3 years, he replied.
"Why do you ask?"
"Because according to the personnel database, Commander Velzon died in a transport accident 6 months ago." The holographic figure's expression shifted from confusion to something much more sinister.
"Very perceptive, Recruit Martinez.
I had hoped you would simply follow orders and destroy the laboratory as instructed."
"Who are you?" Ela demanded.
"Someone who understands that the Coalition's research into stellar compression technology poses an unacceptable threat to galactic stability," the false commander replied. "The power to compress stars should not exist in any hands, regardless of their claimed good intentions."
The saboteur's identity was becoming clearer.
This was not a Ravager operation or even a standard enemy infiltration. This was an ideological opponent who genuinely believed that certain technologies were too dangerous to exist.
"You're from the purest faction," Ela realized.
"You believe that high-energy physics research should be banned throughout the galaxy."
"I believe that some knowledge is too dangerous for any species to possess," the saboteur confirmed.
"The stellar compression research at this facility could lead to weapons capable of destroying entire solar systems.
Such power would inevitably be misused." The ethical dilemma was more complex than Ela had initially realized.
The saboteur was not entirely wrong. Stellar compression technology could potentially be weaponized in devastating ways. But destroying the research would also eliminate potential benefits like unlimited clean energy and faster-than-light transportation.
"So you fabricated a Ravager attack to trick the Coalition into destroying its own research," she said. "A regrettable necessity.
The research must be stopped, but I prefer not to harm innocent people if it can be avoided."
Ela found herself in an impossible position.
She could expose the saboteur and preserve the research, potentially allowing the development of dangerous weapons. Or she could allow the deception to continue, ensuring that the knowledge was destroyed but also validating the use of deception and sabotage to enforce ideological positions. But, as she studied the situation more carefully, she realized there might be a third option.
"The stellar compression device isn't just a power generator," she said suddenly.
"It's a prototype for something much more significant." She accessed deeper levels of the research data, looking beyond the basic technical specifications to understand the theoretical framework behind the project.
"This isn't about energy generation or weapons," she realized. "This is about space-time manipulation."
The stellar compression creates localized gravitational fields strong enough to affect the fabric of reality itself.
The implications were staggering. True space-time manipulation would revolutionize everything from transportation to communication to the fundamental understanding of physics itself.
It would also create possibilities for destruction that made conventional weapons seem like toys. "That's precisely why the research must be stopped," the saboteur insisted.
"Such power would inevitably corrupt those who possessed it."
"Not if it's regulated properly," Ela countered. "The Coalition has successfully managed other dangerous technologies through international treaties and monitoring systems."
"Treaties can be broken. Monitoring systems can be subverted. The only way to prevent misuse is to ensure the knowledge never exists in the first place." Ela found herself genuinely torn between competing ethical positions. The saboteur's concerns were legitimate. Space-time manipulation technology could indeed pose existential threats to galactic civilization.
But destroying the research would also eliminate potential benefits that could improve life for billions of people. As she wrestled with the dilemma, she became aware that something had changed in the simulation around her. The emergency lighting had shifted from red to amber, and the sounds of battle in the distance had stopped. "You have been analyzing this scenario for 18 minutes, announced Instructor Veltar's voice from everywhere and nowhere. "Explain your decision-making process." Ela realized that the entire scenario had been a test of her ability to navigate complex ethical situations under pressure.
There was no single correct answer. The instructors wanted to see how she would approach an impossible moral dilemma. The scenario presents a false choice between preserving dangerous knowledge and destroying valuable research, she explained. But both options accept the premise that the knowledge is inherently dangerous and cannot be safely regulated.
Continue.
The real solution is to change the fundamental assumptions of the problem. Instead of asking whether the research should exist or be destroyed, we should be asking how to ensure it develops safely and benefits everyone.
She gestured toward the holographic displays showing the stellar compression device.
The technology itself is neutral, it can be used for creation or destruction depending on how it's applied.
The goal should be to maximize beneficial applications while minimizing harmful ones. How would you accomplish that? International oversight from the beginning of development. Shared research programs that prevent any single faction from gaining monopolistic control.
Built-in safety systems that make weaponization technically impossible. And, most importantly, open publication of theoretical frameworks so that the scientific community can identify potential dangers before they become practical threats. Veltar's voice carried a note of what might have been approval.
You reject both the saboteur's position and the standard military approach?
I reject the assumption that complex problems have simple solutions, Ela replied.
The saboteur believes destruction is the only way to prevent misuse. Military thinking often assumes that superior force can solve ethical dilemmas. Both approaches ignore the possibility of creative alternatives. And, if creative alternatives are not available? If you must choose between destruction and potential catastrophe? Ela considered the question carefully.
Then, I would choose the option that preserves the greatest number of future possibilities while minimizing immediate harm. But, I would also work to create new alternatives even after making that choice. The simulation environment began to dissolve around her, the holographic displays fading as the reality engine returned to its default configuration. She found herself back on the central platform, surrounded by the other recruits who were waiting their turns.
Acceptable reasoning, Veltar announced.
Recruit Martinez demonstrates advanced ethical analysis and creative problem-solving under pressure. She also shows appropriate skepticism toward false dichotomies and oversimplified solutions. As Ela stepped back to join the other waiting recruits, she noticed that several instructors were conferring in rapid clicks and whistles. Their body language suggested intense discussion, possibly even disagreement.
"What did they make you face?" whispered Marcus as she rejoined the group. "A choice between competing ethical positions," Ela replied quietly. "No right answers, just different degrees of wrongness."
"Sounds like real military decision-making," Devon observed grimly. One by one, the other recruits were called forward to face their own personalized scenarios. Each test was different, designed to exploit individual weaknesses while demanding peak performance under impossible circumstances. Marcus faced a scenario where he had to choose between saving civilian lives and completing a critical military objective. Sarah confronted a situation where her systematic approach was actively counterproductive.
Devon was forced to lead a unit where following traditional military protocol would result in certain defeat. Some recruits succeeded in finding creative solutions to their dilemmas.
Others made difficult choices with grace and moral clarity.
A few broke down completely under the pressure, their failures resulting in immediate elimination from the program. Finally, all the scenarios were complete.
The 37 remaining recruits stood together on the central platform while the instructors completed their evaluations.
"The final examination is now concluded," announced Veltar. 23 recruits have demonstrated the analytical thinking, ethical reasoning, and adaptive capabilities required for graduation from Terano training.
Ela felt her heart race as she waited to hear whether her name would be called.
12 weeks of impossible challenges had led to this moment.
12 weeks of discovering strengths she had never known she possessed and learning to trust her own judgment under pressure.
The following recruits will receive assignments.